Welcome, everyone. I'm Dorottya Zsiborács. I'm here an MSc student at YI, and I'm also working for DNSRF with Emily and Georgia, which we are really pleased to have today. So to everyone online and in the room, welcome to the Evaluating the Internet Governance Forum in a Broader Digital Governance Landscape talk and then workshop. We are delighted to have Emily Taylor and Georgia Osborn with us today to present the findings and insights from the DNS Research Federation report, which is actually, we have a print out here, which we can share as the presentation goes along, which assesses the impact of the Internet Governance Forum in anticipation of the WSIS Plus 20 review. Emily Taylor is a founder of the DNS Research Federation and also the CEO of Oxford Information Labs. A lawyer by training, Emily has worked in the internet sector for nearly 20 years. She is also an associate fellow at Chatham House and is the editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy and also a co-founder of ICANN accredited registered Netistore. Georgia is a senior research analyst at Oxford Information Labs with more than 5 years of experience, previously working within counterterrorism, law enforcement, intelligence analysis, investigations, and policy analysis. Georgia has also previously worked in an international law firm chaired by Terry Blair, QC, and in a policy think tank. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. The presentation first will run about 30-40 minutes, which will be about the net effects of an evidence-led exploration of the IGF impact. And then we will have a short break and then a workshop followed by that. If you are joining us online, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and those in the room, save your questions until the end, and we will answer them after the talk. If you wish to ask questions with your mic or camera on, please raise your hand during the Q&A, and we will call on you. Be aware that this will be included in the recording. Well, it's great to have you, Emily and Georgie, here, and I'll hand it over now to Emily.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for arranging this. As Dorottya said, we will take you through this the report on the Internet Governance Forum. For people who are interested in the workshop, I'm going to add a little bit more background on the World Summit on the Information Society, which was why we started this study. So in a nutshell, the Internet Governance Forum is due to have its mandate reviewed at the end of next year as part of the World Summit on the Information Society, or WSIS Plus 20. So the original WSIS happened 20 years ago. And at various points, the outcomes of that UN process have been reviewed, and new resolutions have been passed, looking to the future. So 20 years on, if you think about the World Summit on the Information Society first occurred between 2003 and 2005, a time where there was substantially more confidence in the sort of the ability of countries to work together cooperatively, substantially more confidence in the ability of private sector or multi-stakeholder-led governance mechanisms, and the sort of the prevailing trends in regulation at the time were very much of let the market play and resist regulating. All of those aspects have changed. There's much more pessimism about the ability of countries to cooperate with one another, much more geopolitical competition, particularly focusing on technology, and a lot more of an ideological differences around what the future governance of technology should look like and how it should be approached. And for all of those reasons, those from sort of democratic governments are quite worried about what will happen in the review of the World Summit on the Information Society 20 years on, because there the UN General Assembly gets to make resolutions about you know, looking back, how did we do in the World Summit on the Information Society the first time round? How do we do last time in terms of the resolutions and how we're doing on governing the internet? And also, you know, it provides an opportunity for the geopolitical competition to manifest itself. And we've already seen in recent UN environments that there have been successful resolutions passed to really get the United Nations to play a much more leading role in governing the internet. So we saw the resolution on the establishment of an open-ended working group on responsible state behaviour in cyberspace. That was passed as a result of a Russian motivated resolution a few years ago. There was also, again, originating from a Russian resolution in the UN General Assembly, passed with the resistance of US and a lot of like-minded groups, a resolution to establish a global cybercrime treaty negotiations. That ad hoc committee is going. It's going quite slowly. But so you see that within the UN environment, we're now from the perspective of, say, US, EU, and countries, the like-minded countries that have traditionally favoured what we would call a multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance, the numbers are not stacking up anymore in the UN. And so this is another reason why the World Summit on the Information Society process is viewed with some trepidation. So we were commissioned by the UK government to prepare this report and really to explore what impact the Internet Governance Forum has had, tangible impact it has had, and looking particularly from the perspective of G77 countries, the group of developing countries where there are more than 77 members, that is a UN grouping. I'm sure you're familiar with, right? So Dorottya will take you through our methodology in a minute, but just we took a mixed methods approach based on interviews and analysis of the last 10 years of the proceedings of the Internet Governance Forum. And although it might seem like quite an easy thing to do, to say, well, look at this institution and see what tangible impact it has had, is actually quite a daunting project to have been given, because the Internet Governance Forum is a place for dialogue. It deliberately was set up not to make decisions, not to do things, but to be a place where people could convene. So thinking about, well, what impact has it had? Because its mandate will be renewed or not renewed in a couple of years' time, was actually a bit more of a daunting challenge than it might otherwise have appeared. So I think I will, oh no. So what did we find? A big spoiler alert here. If you don't want to listen to the rest of the presentation, if you take nothing else away, what we found is that the Internet Governance Forum has made a lasting and significant direct and indirect impact globally. And it's that soft power. It acts as a connection point. It brings people together. It has very low barriers to entry and participation, particularly for young people. It's an area, how many of you have been to or have heard of the Internet Governance Forum? Been to? And are you part of any groups in the IGF that you've been to? So,
yeah, I'm part of the West African IGF. I'm part of the Nigerian IGF. I've attended several of the global IGF.
Wonderful. Yeah. So we'll come on to the national and regional IGFs in a minute. And what about you?
Not part of any. I've heard and have friends who participated in several different.
Yeah. So one of the interviewees said to me, it really struck me that, compared to the other internet governance processes where they're very much more working sessions, and you have sort of a much more expert, if you like, a grouping, you can't really self-identify as a newcomer with such ease as you can at the IGF, that you can go in and participate in dialogue much more. But the national and regional IGFs that you mentioned are very much part of the success story and have really reached very impressive international coverage. And it's all the more impressive when you reflect that it was never mandated, it was never actually envisioned in the original foundational documents for the Internet Governance Forum. And in short, the IGF, we found, provides a voice to stakeholders globally who would otherwise struggle to have their voice heard or participate in other multi-stakeholder governance processes. Okay, so Dorottya, if you go with the
Right. Just gonna quickly talk about what exactly the downward methodology. Actually, we were really lucky to have our team on ground at the latest Internet Governance Forum in Kyoto, where they were really active and interviewed many people. So half of or like the majority of interviews, I would say, took place in person, and then the other section we did online. And obviously, since Emily has been in this space and the whole senior analyst team has been in this place for years, we were really lucky to have access to senior experts in the internet governance space. So we were lucky to interview people from the MAG at IGF and other people who have been in this space since 2005, which was when the Tunis agenda was set out, which basically established the whole mandate of the Internet Governance Forum. So in terms of the interviews, we interviewed 48 internet governance experts, and we paid attention to make sure that we interview people from a wide variety of sectors. So you can see that we interviewed people from the civil society, just as much as from private sector, government, technical community, and also from the youth, which I will talk about later, but it was really important for us how the youth seen the Internet Governance Forum. Also, when it came to regional distribution of interviewees, we paid attention to have interviewees from the Global South and see their perspective on what has the Internet Governance Forum provided to them. And then that was about the interviews, but then we also did a substantial part of task-based research, which was about 1,500 documents that we analyzed with the help of AI and ML, and we are also really lucky to have a tech team who definitely assisted and played a huge part in making our report really successful in terms of that is truly data-driven and objective analysis of what exactly has been going on in the conversations. So we were really lucky to have them to basically analyze all this huge number of documents, which really hasn't been analyzed before in a systematic way. And so we managed to look at different documents that are relevant in the Internet Governance Forum, such as the annual meeting proceedings, where they usually summarize what has been going on in the forum, what were the main topics, such as let's say data governance, digital divide, and all these things. And then here you can see the number of documents that we analyzed and different type of sessions. So they have the high-level leaders track the workshops and the main sessions that we especially paid attention to when it came to the analysis. And here you can just see how we worked. That.live is basically the platform that we use to analyze all these documents, and then you can here see the different distribution of the documents, interviews, regional reports, workshops, transcripts, and all these type of basically sources that we use to put together this report. And now I'm gonna give it over to Georgia.
Was it me or you? I can't remember.
I think it was.
Yeah, so first of all, when we're talking about impact, what do we actually mean? So the report sets out our framework for impact, and what we did was we went back to the foundational document for the Internet Governance Forum, the Tunis agenda, from 2005. Paragraph 72 is the paragraph that deals with the setting up of a new space for dialogue, the Internet Governance Forum. And what we did was we picked out, you know, the essence of the Tunis Agenda mandate and built our framework for analysis around it. And for this, what we distilled out of that was two main buckets for impact. One is where we say, well, if the IGF hadn't got involved, this outcome either wouldn't have happened at all or wouldn't have happened successfully. And second is that is the direct impact. The second is more indirect impact, where the Internet Governance Forum is part of a wider ecosystem of governance. And so it is contributing to, where you can say, well, it really did play a significant role in contributing to, but of course it didn't cause a particular outcome. That is the indirect impact bucket. But so those are the two main areas that we're going to come on to. And first, Dorottya mentioned that we interviewed 48 people for this study, and the sort of as a warm-up exercise, we asked them, you know, do you agree that the IGF should have its mandate renewed, and can you think of any direct or indirect impact from the IGF for your stakeholder group? And you can see that 93% of people we interviewed supported the renewal of the IGF's mandate. And Dorottya has taken you through the interviewees. They did not all come from one stakeholder group, one geography, one age group. This was deliberately tried to be a balanced group of people who would represent diverse views. And also 70% of people viewed the Internet Governance Forum as having had a relevant policy impact for their stakeholder group. So on the direct impact side, what do we find? And, you know, again, looking from the perspective of G77 countries, and also looking back at both the foundational mandate for the IGF and also the last WSIS forum resolutions, which we've shared with you in advance. We were looking for, you know, what impact has the IGF had in terms of connectivity and bridging the digital divide, which was a key aspect of its mandate. And we found, yes, we can see direct impact in interconnection in Global South, also an enabling, an environment that has enabled regulation for community connectivity, those community networks that do not represent commercially attractive or viable prospects for the private sector, but where there is definitely a need. These have an enormous impact in bridging digital divides. We've talked a little bit about the national and regional IGFs. We saw, I mean, that's been an amazing success story, and also nurturing new generations of leadership in internet governance. So internet exchange points, do we know what internet exchange points are? Does anybody? So if you have an internet exchange point, what it means is that the operators within your geographical region all physically peer their traffic, meaning that, so I'm on a particular network, you're on a different network, you're on a different network, we're all going to Facebook, Google, whatever. And so when I'm looking up a domain name and going to a website that somebody else in that geographical region has been to, then they can go, don't bother looking it up, I know where that is. So they're peering their traffic, they're sharing their knowledge, and that leads to, it doesn't really matter as much what the technicality is. What matters is it reduces costs, it reduces the speed, or sort of increases the speed, reduces latency. And so 20 years ago, Africa had barely 12 functioning internet exchange points across the entire continent. And that meant that people in Africa, compared to the rest of the world, were paying a lot more and getting terrible service. If you put internet exchange points into a region, you start to get really interesting effects and second order effects, because when you've got, like, try playing a multiplayer game when you've got terrible latency, it's just pointless. Try streaming movies, streaming videos, and you've got terrible connectivity, really, you know, when you're on dial-up. Does anyone remember dial-up? Does anybody connect through dial-up? No. Well, so when I was at first online, my bit rate was 9 bits per second. And so you sort of type an email, send it, go make a cup of tea, and if you were lucky, it would have sent by the time you got back. So actually, we are just completely used to having very high bandwidth. And with a high bandwidth, with low cost, you can do an awful lot more online. So actually, internet exchange points are an incredibly important building block in reducing digital divides. Now, how do we know? Why do we claim that the Internet Governance Forum played a role in establishing these now 53 active internet exchange points? Because the people who established them told us that. They said, we went to the Internet Governance Forum, we met people who were talking about this peering and internet exchange points. We didn't know what they were talking about. We talked to them, we got funding, we went back home and set them up. And that, you know, talking to, for example, some of the people who set up IXPs in Nigeria, they were saying that a whole load of really amazing stuff starts happening when you've got an exchange point. You get content delivery networks moving in. So a lot of the big players then sort of establish themselves where an internet exchange point is. And, you know, things like where there's a very vibrant home movie industry, that suddenly can reach a much more international audience. So it's not just about the pipes and wires, it's about what they enable. Also, we will talk about the regional and national internet governance forums in a minute. But when we're looking at the dialogue between where it took place at the regional level in the green here, and also at the national level here in the blue, you can see that it's sort of like spanning, it's visiting the international, and then it's going national, and then it's coming back again. And that's a really nice example of the way that actually, so here we've got a little bit of activity at the global level in the 2006 to 2013 level, and then it really takes off at the point where it's being implemented nationally and regionally. That's where the real nitty-gritty conversations happen at the regional IGFs, and it comes back, reporting back in a few years later, where people are talking about their successes, and then coming back again in the regional and national levels. So I talked about internet exchange points in Africa. The second big area of prominence and impact for the Internet Governance Forum is in community networks. As I said earlier, community networks often in regionally very remote places where it's actually hard to put down the infrastructure you need, and not very attractive for commercial players to establish those networks. This is something that really sort of got up on its feet in Latin America, where you've got, you know, there's amazing sort of programs to do connectivity in the Amazonian rainforest, an extremely remote region, and exploring all sorts of different technologies of getting the internet onto the ground. But also, you know, how do you set up where you have to have a license to provide a network? How do you get that licensing? How do you get the communities recognized by the license givers? And the community connectivity, not just as a phenomenon itself, but as a way of governing, as a way of licensing, really owes its origins and its success to the Internet Governance Forum. And you can see again that what happens is that the community networks, they come and go in terms of topics. They hop between the the national and regional level in Latin America. They go up to the global level in the Internet Governance Forum, and then they come down and land again in Africa, and you start to see the community networks regulated at that level. So the national and regional and IGFs, we're going to do this bit, I'll do it. So the national and regional IGFs have sprung up on their own. They were not designed into the mandate of the Internet Governance Forum. They started to appear very early on in the Internet Governance Forum's life cycle. For example, I was involved in setting up the UK IGF in 2007. But you can see what we've done here is mapping in green countries that have a national IGF, but also we've put on, in different regions where there is a regional IGF. So you mentioned that you're part of, is it the Nigeria IGF or West African IGF? And even in areas like the Gulf, where there is not a particularly strong national IGF movement, the Arab IGF is incredibly lively and impactful. And so that has brought together stakeholders from the region. Now, why does this matter? I mean, speaking to people from, for example, from the Arab region, we had an interviewee from an Arab state government, and what they were saying is, we were working away on ICT policy in our country. We went to the IGF and we met loads of people from our country who were also engaged in ICT and development, but we had never met them, and we didn't really have a venue to meet and interact with them at home. And so we sort of all met at the global IGF, then went back home and started the Arab IGF, which brings together stakeholders from all different backgrounds. And that's been a very active version. But you see that actually, wherever you're living in the world, you've probably got a regional IGF. And our analysis of the regional and national documents compared to the international documents shows that the regional and national IGFs talk about things that matter in the region. And so there is that sort of bottom-up process of bringing things up to the international level based on stuff that matters to people locally. And this basically makes the points that I've just spoken about. They enrich one another, and you can see here the growth that's happened over time, and also in the darker colours, the youth IGF, which really was a programme that started relatively more recently, and also the regional levels, which have grown steadily through time. So, not too.
So one thing that I found really interesting, and this was one of our main findings, is that how basically the youth is unable to get into internet governance conversations through the IGF, which is not always the case when it comes to internet governance forums that are more established for senior or more expert like policymakers, such as like ICANN or other forums. So basically, we done interviews with multiple young leaders from the countries that you see highlighted, but there are actually 42 youth initiatives worldwide that contribute to the whole community of youth IGFs. And we found basically three key points. The first is that the IGF enabled capacity building for the youth and the emergence of next generation leaders, and basically served as a welcoming forum for newcomers. The second one was about consideration of youth as local champions and active participants in internet governance. And that really matters because they brought up issues that other more senior leaders wouldn't really, for example, talk about. So one youth from Togo, for example, she talked about how data protection has been really important in Togo and how that contributed to the emergence of a cybersecurity center that she has been really involved in, not only establishing, but basically having discussions about, for example, with AI coming in, and obviously a lot of companies are trying to like breaking into this industry, how important it is to have data governance and data privacy law in place before, AI being really prevalent in the region. So they really know what is important in the region for the youth, and they're really able to advocate through these networks and reach senior government leaders through being able to be at the same place at the IGF forums. So it's also, sometimes not easy to reach senior governance leaders, but if you are going to an IGF forum and if you're able to live in this ecosystem throughout the whole year, you have a direct access to these people. So that has been really important for these next generation leaders. And lastly, we also found that there is actually a cross-regional collaboration among youth initiatives, and it's mostly south-to-south cooperation. So, for example, between Bangladesh and the Democratic Republic of Congo, young leaders collaborate to address common challenges, but also they share practices, and they are able to secure support for their initiatives throughout these cross-regional initiatives. And you can see some of the quotes here. That basically just underlines how empowered they felt by being part of the IGF, and what are some of the issues that they are working on, such as cybersecurity, data protection, and these kind of initiatives that they learned by talking to the youth, setting up educational programs, and then brought that to the IGF, or were talking about those issues throughout the year within the ecosystem of the IGF. So it's also important to consider IGF not just as one of the annual sessions that they meet at, but also it is an ecosystem that they are part of and able to advocate for the issues that they find important throughout the whole year. So that's about the direct findings, and now we will move on to the indirect impact of the IGF.
So as Emily mentioned earlier, we looked at the direct impact and the indirect impact. Sorry, there we go. So what we found was that not only is there direct impact that the IGF has had, where it's been quite essential to making policy change, but there's also been that sort of soft power, or I guess decisions shaping instead of decision-making power. So what we found is in the IGF, in this particular forum, by one of the things that we found was that there is dynamism in looking at different themes in a much more rapid and current way than in other forums where the internet and policy around the internet is discussed. So, for example, things like data protection, we could see it particularly when analysing the documents and the text that we analyse through the methodology that Dorottya mentioned, that the data protection was immediately picked up as something that was going to be talked about. And it was talked about for a specific period of time when GDPR, the General Data Protection Act, was discussed and implemented, and then quickly sort of began to drop off as it became more settled. And the same with other issues. So you can see that this reflects the kind of speed at which the internet kind of evolves, which isn't necessarily the case for other decision-making forums. And then also that it facilitates global dialogue. I mentioned GDPR. There's also the IANA transition, which Emily will talk about, but I'll just quickly go into why that's the case for GDPR. In other countries where they were trying to struggle and get to grips with data protection quite quickly, they used the IGF, we found, as a way of talking to each other and understanding data protection in Europe and in other countries to then help with data protection laws in their own countries. And then again, with the case of online harms, which Emily will again speak about. So thematic dynamism, this goes into some of the text analysis that we looked at. So what we found was with areas of human rights and accessibility. So these are the themes that we looked at, which are human rights, accessibility, privacy, surveillance, data protection, internet use and impact, and then, you know, things like freedom of expression, what we found was certain terms were sort of thought about in the IGF. So what we find with the internet and sort of policy terms is we don't necessarily know things like disinformation. This is a sort of new term that sort of came about after these sort of disinformation sort of came to be. As you go into these forums and you discuss these issues, you start to come up with terms that reflect the things that you're talking about. And so sort of things like disinformation and freedom of expression are discussed, and then certain terms are then thought about and then brought into being through the Internet Governance Forum. And then also very quickly introduces new topics just at the point where they come up, which is not also the same for other internet governance spaces, which if you are familiar with any UN process or any policy making process, it can be quite slow, quite bureaucratic. Whereas here, what we found was the way that issues are talked about and discussed happen almost as quickly as when they appear in the space. And again, it sort of shows the sort of, I'm not sure if you want to discuss this.
Yeah.
Sorry, Emily.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that comes through in the WSIS +10 resolution that we circulated in advance of the session is the focus on bridging digital divides and on making sure that internet governance is inclusive to people throughout, you know, no matter where they come from. What the Internet Governance Forum does structurally in asking people, when you make an application to have a workshop or a session at the Internet Governance Forum, you need to show that your panels are inclusive of the different stakeholder groups. You can't just have a bunch of your mates from back home who are all going to agree with each other. And that sort of and you've also got to know who's your youth person, who is your person from private sector, what about Global South? And actually the organising committee for the Internet Governance Forum prompts organisers to include multiple stakeholder voices in their applications. And we can see that inclusion of Global South perspectives also brings finds expression in the things that are talked about. So, for example, bridging the digital divide has been a perennial theme in the Internet Governance Forum since it was set up. The pandemic, as you know, actually hastened an awful lot of connectivity and increased connectivity, particularly in Africa. And then the dialogue sort of evolves into, well, it's not just about getting people online, it's about getting people to be meaningfully online. So that everybody is able to work and enjoy the online environment without those digital divides. Georgia mentioned the IANA transition. So does this mean anything to anybody around the table? No. If I talk about the domain name system, does this ring a bell? So domain names are what we use to navigate the internet, and they you know, actually play a big part in everybody's online journey. They begin and end everybody's online journey. So the domain name system is organized hierarchically. So it's organized under so-called top-level domains like .com, .uk, .cn, .ng, you know, for different countries. And at the top, and each of those top-level domains organizes its own thing. So you could have oxford.ac.uk, you could also have oxford.com. They're organized in different groups, and they can have the same name. But right at the top of the hierarchy is the so-called root directory, right? So that is the catalogue of the top level domains. If you took that away, there wouldn't be a consistent hierarchical approach, and that would mean that domain names were no longer guaranteed to be unique and no longer would resolve universally. Okay, so that top node, who's heard of it? nobody because it's quite boring. It's boring because it works, but it's actually very strategically important. From its inception until 2016, who was in charge of it? Guess. Have a wild guess about who was in charge of the topmost node, the most influential node of the domain name system.
The small, like 7 people.
Good guess, I like it. But given that they didn't exist when the internet was invented, have another guess. You're on the right lines in some ways in terms of influence and that sort of, you know, and you're in the right kind of geography.
The icon.
ICANN, and who was in charge? So ICANN was operating the route, you're quite right. And who was in charge of authorizing each change to the route?
To the US.
It was the US government. Well done. So that was a very controversial for some people, and it was actually a very bright fire that was animating most people in the original World Summit on the Information Society. How come the US government is doing this role? How come the US government has the power to take whole countries offline if it decides to? There was never any evidence that it abused that role, but still the potential is there, and it doesn't really feel very globally equitable, does it? Well, so actually this was such a controversial topic that the Internet Governance Forum didn't even dare to explore it in its first meeting back in 2006. But what we found is that, in fact, you know, to cut a long story short, after Snowden, it became really that was the point where the US government said, okay, we're going to give up this role, right? And there was then a 2-year process where the ICANN community discussed what was going to happen, what was going to replace it. You know, it's boring, it's largely symbolic, but it's actually quite difficult to think of something that would tick all the boxes in terms of legitimacy and stability to replace it. It has gone, as you said, to ICANN, to the ICANN community. The global community are now the looking after the essential DNS part. The Internet Governance Forum certainly didn't cause the IANA transition to occur. It didn't formulate the solution, but many of the people we spoke to articulated the same thing to us, which is that actually the Internet Governance Forum, this was this space for dialogue where no decisions would be made. And so it wasn't threatening to anybody, but it enabled people to understand why change was needed. So the technical community, the US government, a lot of democratic government, if you talk to them in 2005, they would be like, no way is the IANA needed. It works, it's perfect, blah, blah, blah. But actually the exposure to other points of view through the Internet Governance Forum definitely led to a sense like things really need to change. And that change is not a defeat, it's actually a natural evolution in a global level. It's also another example of the thematic dynamism that Georgia was talking about, because here we see the point at which the IANA transition was really hot as a topic around 2014, just after the US government announced that it was prepared to give it up. And then it was still really vibrant and occurring. It's in the top 10 of the most discussed issues in 2016. And then the IANA transition happened and it's really barely mentioned. That's a good solution, actually, because if it was still controversial, people would still be talking about it and it would still be appearing. But so the fact that transition occurred, it's very hard to explain to anybody why it was such a big deal, but it was a big deal. It was actually the most controversial issue, believe it or not, in internet governance in 2003 to 2005. Can you believe that? When you think of all the other issues that are troubling us now, but that was the big thing. And so the Internet Governance Forum played a part in helping to make it solvable. Likewise, I think we've got, I'm going backwards, that's why. Well, I've been here before. equally, the discussion of online harms, Georgia talked about disinformation, but actually the regulation of internet content has become something that now most countries are at least talking about, compared to 10 years ago, where the response from, at least from democratic countries, would be like, well, you shouldn't be regulating content. But actually the rise of disinformation, the harms caused by disinformation, the realization of the harms caused to, particularly to young people as a result of exposure to content that they should never be seeing at age inappropriate times, all of these have really sort of collectively gathered together over the last few years. And you can see this reflecting in the Internet Governance Forum dialogue on these topic areas. But also the Internet Governance Forum is not saying here is a blueprint for regulating content, but there are definitely themes that come through in terms of decision shaping. So we need to speed.
Yes, I will speed if I can go the right way. Yes, so as part of our project, we looked at who actually attends this multi-stakeholder forum. And what we could see is actually quite a lot of people, and it is growing. You can see that it's growing year by year, and that it keeps gaining momentum. And that Emily sort of mentioned how welcoming it was for newcomers. Now, we actually found that between 50 and 60% of attendees were newcomers. If you look at other forums where internet governance is discussed, or maybe decisions are made, it is nowhere near that amount of newcomers, is what we found. We also found that more than 40% of women attended internet governance forums since 2016. That hasn't really ever dropped. It's always been 40% or over. And then it's also very geographically diverse. So it's got participants from 178 countries in 2023. As Emily was talking about, there has been the emergence of regional and national IGFs, which I'm sure has really increased the amount of geographically diverse participants in the IGF. You can see here the number of countries attending IGF. Just a quick note as well that the location really matters. I wanted to talk about a little bit of the remote participation, which Emily discussed earlier. The IGF has been a forum that has been renowned in getting remote participation and sorting out the best type of remote participation, I think, out of most other forums, if I'm correct. And sort of people talk about how well they did it. So this shows that location matters. The last Internet Governance Forum happened in Japan, in Kyoto. You can see that the numbers of people in Asia Pacific was very, very high. And the same with Ethiopia. You can see that the location really matters there too. Okay.
Yeah. So just wrapping up, we asked people when we were talking to them, if the Internet Governance Forum didn't exist, what would you consider it? And one person said if we didn't have it, we'd have to invent it. But the main themes that come across in terms of what people would miss, i.e. what they really value about the Internet Governance Forum, is learning from, being inspired by other people, that access to a global audience. Even people from the private sector were saying, actually, we meet people from markets that we would never have the resources to talk to directly, and we can talk to people about how they're using our products. And this wasn't from a large company either. And also just the breadth of the policy dialogue. That Georgia talked about, the thematic dynamism. With some internet governance processes, you can go along at any one year and pretty much have the same conversation with the same people. With the Internet Governance Forum, there are two things that always strike me going to the IGF. One is it feels very young. And secondly, it's always a different meeting. You're talking about different things. Like last year at Kyoto, it was all about AI. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it would have all been about the IANA transition. So of course, nothing is perfect. I mean, we've been taking you through our findings in terms of impact and direct impact, but there are always opportunities to improve everything. Everything created by humans isn't necessarily imperfect and can do with improvement. And despite the global representation that we've seen from Georgia, there's obviously always opportunities to improve that, improve diversity, and also I think improve the access to what happened. Is not, there's an awful lot, it's the difference between, you know, something that's a very open process and something that's very accessible. It's not always easy to remember or to get access to what happened at the IGF. That took us an awful lot of effort to uncover, and a lot of people who are involved in the community like, oh, thanks for doing that, because it is really quite difficult to understand what happened at meetings, what was the impact, and also to translate the dialogue into that political influence, into the policy influence that leads to better regulation. So in short, the IGF, a space for dialogue that isn't supposed to do anything, does have direct impact and indirect impact. Internet governance was a very contentious issue, the management of the domain name system, but the IGF has enabled an inclusive and constructive dialogue that involves lots of diverse stakeholders more successfully. And Dorottya talked about the youth track. Youth are very much incorporated and assimilated into the mainstream dialogue in the IGF in a way that doesn't happen in the other multi-stakeholder processes. We talked about the impact of internet exchange points, of community networks as really tangible examples of improving the quality of internet access and the regulation of non-commercial internet access groups, and the National and Regional and Youth IGF movement, which is a spontaneous, non-mandated, but very successful way of bringing new people to the dialogue. It's also very, very dynamic in terms of the agenda. It responds to things. It's often one of the first places that major events are discussed. So happy to have your questions. Thank you for your attention. And yeah, happy to have your questions, and you can download the report or have a flip through the physical report here. Thank you. So would anybody like to kick off? Yeah, please.
Yes, I have two questions. Yeah, when
What's your name as well?
my name is Raymond.
Raymond, nice to meet you.
When Dorottya, I hope I got the name correct. When you're making your presentation, you're talking about the activities of the youth IGF. I noticed that there is not much activity of youth IGF in North America. Do you particularly find any reason for that? And then secondly, with respect to the IANA transition, I'd like to know what's the current geopolitical composition of ICANN's governing body at that moment?
Nice question. So do you want to do the youth in North America question, Dorottya? Or I can have a go. Yeah. So thanks a lot, Raymond, for those questions. I think that, you know, obviously both the national and regional IGFs and the youth IGFs are not uniformly active everywhere. So some will have one, but not necessarily be that active or stellar. What really came through for me and the research team looking at the youth example was the work in developing countries from the national and regional and the youth individuals, and particularly the energetic way that you see people from the youth IGFs who come up through the national systems. They will often go up into some sort of role in the international IGF, but then also, as Dorottya was saying, sort of return to the country and either do something amazing in cybersecurity, lead something. But your question was like, why isn't there more activity in the youth in North America? I wonder, I don't know the answer, but I would speculate that it's possibly two things. I think that the national and regionals and youth IGFs have been very active in issues of digital divide and connectivity, and perhaps those are less prominent issues. And frankly, I think in North America, internet governance is not that sexy a topic at the moment.
Because the control.
I don't know, or maybe they feel it's a sorted problem. I think not necessarily what an issue I would agree with, but I think it's a great point. Often these things are not that active until somebody activates them. And certainly the youth programs in ICANN, in the Internet Society Ambassadors Program, and so on, they do have global participation. But I mean, we were at the last ICANN meeting. There were quite a few young people from America who were involved.
I just have one thing to add on this, is that so we participated in teaching in the North American School of Internet Governance recently, and I met quite a few people who were based in North America but were not involved in the IGF youth, and I agree with, you know, just from anecdotal experience, yeah, it probably isn't as sort of, you know, big as other IGF movements. But one thing I would say is that different issues come up for different IGF. So having participated in the UK IGF, they were more concerned about sort of the thing that came up for them was obviously AI, as everyone is concerned about, but also making online spaces safe for diverse communities sort of online. This may not be a thing that other countries are so focused on. They might be focused on getting everyone connected in the first place. So I think, you know, if different issues are cared about by different countries and different sort of movements, they have different ways of expressing those priorities.
Your second question about the representation of
Position
of the governing body. So ICANN, are you familiar with ICANN as an organisation? It does. So Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, formed as a non-profit under California law. So it is structured as a company. It has a board of directors that are nominally responsible, legally responsible for its activities. It also has a staff, of course, and has a community where the policy work happens. The board of directors is actually structurally representative of the ICANN community as it was first designed back in the 1990s. So you've got the different stakeholder groups who are represented there. You have you've got generic name support organisation groups, you've got the country codes, you've got the regional internet registries, you've got the at-large community, and you've also got governments who are not actually part of the board of directors but are sort of have an observer role. There are a certain number of seats that are given up to the nominating committee to fill, and I think that is a global process. But I think that the answer to your question objectively is like at the point where the board of directors changes, it's always very transparent and you can see the background of each of those groups. But I think that, and it will be something that we come on to in the workshop, you know, if you're thinking about how globally representative is ICANN, either as a board of directors or more importantly, as a community, as an active community forming policy, how globally representative is it? I think this is a very interesting discussion to have in the context of the fault lines in multi-stakeholder governance and what would be an attractive area for at least challenge from other countries. Anything else? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk and for introducing your report. Very, very fascinating insights. I had a question about accessibility. You mentioned this as an area of improvement and that it's an open process, but not necessarily accessible. Or, you know, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily accessible. What kind of issues have you come across and what are your thoughts on making it more accessible?
I think it's a bit like you know, it's a bit like the attic room in a house, or a library where you've taken all the books down from the shelves and just thrown them on the floor. I mean, this is an exaggeration. It's not that easy to find the information from it. There's great information in there. There's an amazing array of discussions with great speakers that happen each year, and they are ordered, you know, by year, by topic, and so on. But it's often quite difficult to find out what happened and to get those summaries. There's definitely been improvement. So I think the last session in 2016, so we looked at from 2016 onwards, which was after a sort of little mini reform process. And that led to some changes, like workshop organisers now have to file a report before they're allowed to apply for another report. They have to provide summaries and so on. And there is always an annual report from the IGF, which will sort of give a very high level review of what was discussed. But I think that part of what I hope is the contribution that we were able to make is by actually putting all of those documents from the last 10 years through a sort of automated analysis, was to be able to kind of make sense of them in a more high level way, to pick out high level themes that perhaps the people with the perspective of their own workshop wouldn't have.
Yeah, I would also add that I've done like some of the document analysis, and it wasn't like systematically analyzed what exactly has been talked about at each year. And so I think that like this report was really helpful for everyone who works in internet governance to understand how these discussions have emerged throughout the years. And it's always, there is a report before the IGF happens. I think they already set the themes that they will talk about the next year. So we already have the 2025 IGF themes set out. But after the meeting happens, the capturing of how exactly those themes were discussed was not that systematically analyzed. Just two questions online as well. One of them is asking that after the pandemic, the level of interest and commitment to participate in the IGF and these places has dropped in Elena Ford, who is from NRI Peru perspective. So maybe she asked, maybe it has increased mostly at the remote level, but how do we see this? What are the dynamics between participation offline and online at the IGF? And then the other question is about which is related to our workshop, is that do you think there is a danger that due to the increasing influence of Russia and China state interest compared to IGF representation of EU, UK, US and other democratic allies, there will be an erosion of democratic values within the internet and development of emerging technologies, and what should or can the UK do?
Great, thank you. Do you want to take the remote participation?
Take the remote participation one. So it's interesting when analysing the participation of the IGF, because the way that they did remote was so good. It's not always calculated, and then particularly when the pandemic happened, everything was remote. Participation was still high, but the divide in who was remote and who wasn't remote, it did drop off obviously after the pandemic, and then it sort of recovered in Kyoto in Japan. Part of that also is because location really does matter. We sort of spoke a little bit about the 2025 IGF, which is going to take place in, the 2024 IGF, which is going to take place in Saudi Arabia. Location really matters. So in Kyoto, Japan, we found that not only the main themes were AI, so lots of people were there to talk about AI. We had lots of people from around the world who are AI experts who knew they were going to be speaking about AI, and they were very excited to be in Kyoto, Japan. In Saudi Arabia, you know, some may consider it to be a difficult place to visit. It really does matter. Visas are difficult. You know, there is a constraint on who comes. So in terms of remote participation, it is difficult to say what the driving factor is in who attends in the space and who attends remotely. But I would say location is probably what matters the most.
Thank you. And the question about, you know, geopolitical influence and how do countries like the UK and other like-mindeds ensure that future technology governance reflects values. I mean, I'm always intrigued by this concept of technology regulation with values, because as if values are something static. When you think about values, say values here in the UK on things like gender, sexuality, and mental health, you know, 10 years ago, you couldn't talk about having mental health problems. Now it's almost compulsory. So values change as societies change. And however, I think that the idea of regulating with values is a proxy for co-opting like-minded groups behind certain approaches. And it's definitely true that and I think it comes through a bit, Raymond, in your question, I think that the sort of the US like-mindeds have thought, well, multi-stakeholder is the way to govern the internet, because it always has been that and it always worked, kind of. Now we're going into the WSIS +20 process at a point where geopolitical tensions are very high. They're often expressed through technology and very differing ideological approaches to the governance of technology. And so how one retains, let's say, a free and open internet, a single internet, an internet in which the data can flow seamlessly across borders, or people can express themselves without fear or recrimination. Those sort of very core principles are no longer, I don't think there's much confidence that those are universally supported, or that the numbers in the UN environment would necessarily stack up in favour of the status quo. And I think you know, behind that question is a really important point, is like, do we care enough as democratic countries about the future of the internet to actually turn up to where things are being discussed or where the decisions are being made, and seek to influence the results? Because certainly a lot of other groups and other countries do care enough to turn up. So I don't know the answer, and I think that there is an awful lot at stake, and I'm not quite sure that people are really switched on to it.